He barely scratched the king, and they ripped him apart, alive. Hi audience, I'm Sarah, and today, the dark chapter from history I'm about to share with you is truly horrifying. It's the story of a man whose body was literally ripped apart by horses. A slow, brutal way to die. But here's the strange part. This man didn't even try to kill the king. He only tried to wound him. Yes, wound, not kill. Isn't that shocking? And yet, what followed became one of the most gruesome public executions in European history. Why did he do it? And why did they go so far to make him suffer? Today, we uncover the horrifying fate of Robert-François Damiens. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more true dark chapters from history, forgotten stories the world tried to erase, but we bring back to light. And if you're drawn to these haunting tales, give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Robert-François Damiens was not a revolutionary, not a political figure, and not a man of influence. He was an ordinary, lower-class Frenchman, born in 1715 in the northern town of Arras. Raised in poverty and hardship, his early life offered little comfort. As he grew, Damiens drifted between jobs, domestic servant, soldier, clerk, never quite finding stability, never staying long in one place. But wherever he went, there was one thing he carried with him, a growing sense of unease. Those around him described him as obsessive and overly religious. He would preach morality with a strange intensity that made people uncomfortable. Some called him pious, others whispered that he was mentally unwell. His behavior was erratic, his thoughts clouded by fanaticism. Still, no one could have predicted what he would do next. Quiet, solitary, and simmering with righteous anger, Damiens would go on to commit an act so bold and so horrifying that it shocked all of France. He dared to raise his hand against the king. To understand Damiens' rage, we must first understand the man he tried to wound, King Louis XV. Once adored as Louis the Well-Beloved, the king had long since lost the love of his people. By the mid-1700s, France was rotting beneath the surface. Poverty spread through the streets while the nobility bathed in luxury. Louis XV ruled from the golden halls of Versailles, surrounded by mistresses, scandal, and indulgence. He lived as if God had blessed his pleasures, but many believed he had forsaken God entirely. His government clashed openly with the Catholic Church. In 1762, he approved a decree to dissolve the Jesuit order, one of the most powerful religious institutions in Europe. Their schools were shut down, their priests were exiled. To many devout Catholics, it felt like war against the faith. This act enraged many religious minds, especially one particularly unstable soul named Damiens. To him, the king was no longer a divinely chosen ruler. He was a fallen figure, a sinner. And in Damiens' tortured mind, someone had to make him pay. It was the evening of January 5th, 1757, and a bitter winter wind swept across the courtyard of the Palace of Versailles. King Louis XV, surrounded by his guards and attendants, stepped toward his royal carriage. The moment seemed routine until a lone figure pushed his way through the crowd. It was Damiens. With no cry, no warning, he lunged forward and drove a small penknife into the king's side. The blade pierced skin, but not deeply. It was a minor wound, more symbolic than deadly. Louis XV barely flinched. There was no dramatic collapse, no blood-soaked robes, and yet the shock was immediate. Damiens made no attempt to flee. He stood there, silent, almost calm, as the guards threw him to the ground and dragged him away. The commotion rippled through Versailles. France had not seen anything like this in nearly 2 centuries. The age of divine kingship had been touched, and it would demand vengeance. There was no escape plan, no manifesto, no conspirators, just a madman with a twisted mission: to correct a king. After the failed attack, Damiens was dragged away in chains, bruised, bloodied, and silent. He was thrown into the Conciergerie, a grim fortress on the banks of the Seine, where the walls echoed with the screams of the condemned. It was here that his nightmare began. Authorities were certain he hadn't acted alone. They demanded names, motives, a grand conspiracy, something that would make sense of the madness. He gave them nothing. So they turned to torture. They branded his flesh with red-hot irons, pressing them into his chest, thighs, and arms, until skin sizzled and blackened. They poured boiling oil and molten lead into his open wounds, searing deep into muscle, the pain indescribable. They stretched him on the rack, again and again, until his shoulders tore from their sockets, his knees popped, and his tendons hung loose like cords. And still, he kept his silence. But one day, barely breathing, he whispered through bloody lips, "I didn't want to kill him. I just wanted to wound him, to bring him back to God." There was no plot, no rebellion, just one shattered man with a delusion. The interrogations dragged on, but no conspiracy ever surfaced. No letters, no accomplices, no foreign plot. Robert-François Damiens had acted entirely alone. Even King Louis XV, still recovering from the minor wound, was said to have met Damiens briefly. A quiet, guarded moment. Damien, broken and tortured, reportedly told him, "I only wanted to wound you so you'd feel the pain you let fall on France and on God." The king said nothing in reply, but witnesses claimed he turned pale and walked away in silence. Still, silence wasn't enough. The court didn't want justice. It wanted vengeance. The ministers, the nobles, and even the king himself agreed. This moment had to be a warning, an unforgettable message to the people, that the crown was sacred, and touching it, even slightly, would bring hell upon you. And so, the sentence was passed. Damiens would be executed publicly, not quickly, but painfully. He would be torn apart, alive. The date was set. Paris would watch. March 28, 1757, Place de Grève, Paris. By mid-morning, the square was packed. Tens of thousands had gathered, nobles, peasants, even children, all drawn by the promise of blood. This wasn't just punishment, it was theater. Robert-François Damiens was dragged to the scaffold. He was shirtless, his body covered in scars from the weeks of torture. Chains clinked around his limbs. His face was ghostly pale, hollow-eyed, broken, but he was still alive. The executioners began with red-hot pincers, tearing flesh from his chest, arms, thighs, and calves. With each scream, the crowd flinched, but they didn't look away. Then came the next stage, boiling oil, molten lead, burning resin, all poured into his gaping wounds. Next, they turned to his right hand, the hand that had held the knife. It was burned with molten sulfur, blackened to the bone. And then came the final act. 4 massive horses were tied to his wrists and ankles. At the signal, they pulled. Muscles stretched, joints locked, blood poured, but his body did not come apart. For 2 hours they tried. Damien screamed, howled, but his body held. In the end, the executioners took knives and severed the tendons at his shoulders and hips. Only then did the horses succeed, tearing him limb from limb. His mutilated remains were thrown into a fire, his ashes scattered. France had sent its message. The spectacle was meant to inspire fear and loyalty, but what it inspired was horror. As Damien's screams echoed across the Place de Grève, the crowd, tens of thousands strong, slowly realized they were witnessing something far darker than punishment. Even in a time when beheadings and hangings were common, this was different. This was torture, calculated, extended, and monstrous. Some fainted, others vomited, children cried. Hardened Parisians who had watched executions their entire lives stood frozen, pale, and speechless. When it was over, the silence was eerie. One eyewitness, a French nobleman, would later write, "It was not justice. It was hell disguised in law, a barbarity beyond the darkest ages." Even foreign ambassadors in attendance sent urgent reports home, describing the event as grotesque, inhuman, and unfit for civilized society. What was meant to protect the monarchy's image may have instead cracked its foundation. France had shown its power, but also its cruelty, and cruelty, once seen, is never forgotten. Robert François Damiens died without ever confessing to a conspiracy, because there was none. He was not a revolutionary nor a martyr, just a lone, broken man whose faith had curdled into obsession. Yet his execution became more than just punishment. It became a symbol, not of justice, but of royal cruelty. The gruesome spectacle shocked even loyal monarchists, and though few mourned him, many remembered what was done to him. Historians now call it the last true medieval execution in France, a public ritual of pain, spectacle, and control. It was a death meant to terrify, not correct. Just 3 decades later, a different blade would rise, the guillotine. It promised quick, painless death. It was called more humane, not for mercy, but because even revolutionaries knew the people had seen too much suffering. Philosopher Michel Foucault later reflected on Damiens' fate. It was not just his body that was destroyed, it was his soul on display for the crowd to consume. Damiens became a warning, not of treason, but of what happens when power is afraid. His story isn't just about torture, it's about fear, how power protects itself through terror, not justice. But history remembers cruelty, and within 40 years the same city would rise, storm Versailles, topple the crown, and send its kings to the guillotine, because fear has a limit, and revolution follows.